What would you do if you lifted the canvas of your wagon and found a stranger hiding inside, clutching a knife like her life depended on it? The wind moved through the Wyoming basin like a restless hand, pushing dust across the ground in ragged swirls. It was August 1879, and the sun hung low behind the hills when Holden Heartly heard something soft inside his wagon. It sounded like cloth brushing against wood. He stopped mid-step, one boot on the wagon's sideboard, fingers wrapped tight around a feed sack. The horses beside him stomped, uneasy. His rifle was still on the saddle, too far to reach without turning his back. Holden stepped slowly onto the wagon bed and lifted the canvas flap with care. A woman jumped from the shadows, and the blade she held flashed in the fading light. Her eyes were wide and wild. Her dress hung torn at the hem, one sleeve ripped nearly off. Her hair was tangled, damp with sweat, and her grip on the knife shook, but she held it like she meant every threat it carried. "I thought you were him," she said, breath-catching. Holden raised both hands, calm and slow. "I ain't." She blinked hard, studying him like she was checking every detail. His hat, his dust-covered shirt, his boots worn from long rides. "He wears blue. You're not him." "No," Holden said softly. "I'm not wearing blue." Her shoulders sagged a little, but the knife still trembled in her hand. Holden kept his voice steady. "You got a name?" She didn't answer right away. Fear clung to her like another layer of clothing, old and heavy. She looked about 20, maybe a little more, but the way she held herself looked older, used to trouble. Finally, she whispered, "Sadie." "All right, Sadie," he said. "I'm going to sit down, not touching anything. You keep the knife if it helps, but I'd like to know who you're hiding from." Sadie swallowed hard. "I ran," she said. Her voice cracked. "He said I belonged to him. I don't." Holden didn't need more than that. The pain in her eyes told enough. He eased himself onto the wagon floor and nodded. "That man hurt you." Her silence held the truth. "You hungry?" he asked. Her stomach answered for her, growling loud in the quiet air. She flushed and looked away. Holden reached into a flour sack beside him, tore off a piece of biscuit, and slid it toward her with 2 fingers. Sadie grabbed it quick, like a starving animal afraid it might be snatched back, and ate it in small, desperate bites. "You can stay the night," Holden said gently. "I'll keep watch. Nobody's going to touch you while I'm breathing." Sadie looked at him with tired doubt. "Why are you helping me?" Holden shrugged. "Because I got a sister somewhere out east, and I'd want someone to help her if she was in trouble." She settled back against the wagon wall. The knife stayed in her hand, but her grip loosened. She watched Holden as he fed the horses and started a fire. When he handed her a canteen of water, she whispered, "Thank you," like it was a word she hadn't spoken in years. That night, Holden slept on the ground beside the wagon with his rifle laid across his lap. Coyotes called far off. Leaves rustled in the dark. He didn't sleep much, but he didn't mind. He kept one ear turned toward the wagon, listening for trouble. By morning, the sky had cleared. Sadie stepped down from the wagon wearing the same torn dress, but her posture had shifted. She stood straighter, like she was trying to remember how to hold herself without fear. "I won't go back," she said. "Then don't," Holden replied. "You got anywhere to go?" Quote. Sadie hesitated. "No, he burned my papers." "Took my horse." Holden nodded slowly. "I'm headed north past Buffalo. There's a ranch near Clear Creek that needs help. You got a mind to work?" "I can sew. Cook, too." "That'll do." They traveled under a hot, endless sun. Holden rode his bay gelding. Sadie sat tucked in the wagon bed, the knife still near her side. She watched Holden at first with caution, then with something softer, almost curious. He talked little, asked less. 2 days into the journey, Sadie finally spoke more. "His name was Roy," she said quietly. "I worked for a family near Rawlins. He passed through with a cattle drive. He followed me behind the barn. Said I was his now. I told him no." Quote. Holden's jaw tightened. "You got away?" She nodded. "Last week, he drank himself out cold. I took his knife and ran." "You did right," Holden said. "You fought for yourself." She looked at him for a long moment. You don't look at me like I'm broken. I don't think you are. Their days on the trail grew easier after that. She helped gather firewood and warmed beans over the fire. Once, she laughed at something he said, and Holden nearly dropped his coffee pot. On the 5th night, rain started to fall. Holden rigged the tarp so she could stay dry under the wagon while he kept watch outside. In the dark, she said through the canvas, I thought you were him that first night. I saw. I was shaking so hard. You were brave. I'm tired of being afraid. Then lean on me, Holden said before he could think twice. There was a pause. All right. By the 7th day, the bighorn foothills rose before them like a soft promise. Holden pointed to the far ridge. Clear Creek is past that hill. The ranch is close. Sadie looked at the land, then at him. And you? Quote, I'll stay nearby a while. Make sure you settle. You don't have to, she said softly. I want to. That night they camped one last time before reaching the ranch. Sadie sat close beside him, closer than she ever had. Her voice was quiet. I've been alone a long time. So have I, Holden answered. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and this time he didn't hold back. He let her rest there while the fire burned low. For the first time since he met her, she didn't look over her shoulder. The Heartly ranch sat quiet against the hills, its barn old but sturdy, its fences weathered but mended. A milk cow stood tied near a lean-to, and the smell of hay drifted warm through the morning air. When Sadie stepped down from Holden's wagon, her boots touched the ground like she wasn't sure she was allowed to stand on it. She looked tired, but she also looked like someone trying to start again. Mrs. Heartly waited on the porch, sleeves rolled up, apron dusted with flour. Her eyes moved from Holden to Sadie in one sharp, careful sweep. Is she yours? She asked. Holden shook his head. No, ma'am. She's her own. Mrs. Heartly nodded once. Good. I got pie dough waiting and dishes stacked since sunrise. If she can lift a skillet, she's hired. Sadie followed her inside without looking back, and Holden led his horse to the creek. He thought he'd ride on, but he didn't. Something held him there. Maybe it was the way Sadie had leaned against him by the fire the night before, or the way she'd said she was tired of being afraid. By dusk, Sadie came out to the porch with a basin of warm water. Her sleeves were pinned up, her hair pulled back with a piece of string. Her hands were red from scrubbing, but her eyes had settled into something steady. You all right? Holden asked from the fence. Sadie nodded. She works hard. Expects the same. I like her. That's good. She looked at him for a moment. You? Still heading north? Not yet. Why not? Horses need rest, he said. Sadie's mouth twitched like she almost smiled. You're lying. Maybe. Inside the house, Mrs. Heartly served stew thick with barley and onions. Tobias, her son, barely 11, carried 2 buckets at a time like he'd been doing it forever. After supper, Holden chopped wood with him while Sadie washed pans by lantern light. Later, when the house settled, she stepped onto the porch. The night was cool. Crickets filled the quiet. You don't talk much, she said. Only when it's worth saying. She breathed slow. The man I ran from, Roy, he found me once, after I tried running the first time, caught me behind the smokehouse. Told me I couldn't outrun him. He laughed like he meant it. Holden didn't say a word. I hit him with a sack of flour, she continued, ran while he was coughing, stayed hidden in the creek reeds till morning. Sadie leaned against the post, the lantern light brushing her face. Sometimes I think I should have killed him. Maybe I still should. Holden looked at her long and steady. I ain't going to tell you how to feel, but you did what you had to. You stayed alive. Sadie's jaw tightened. He's out there, and I don't want to keep looking over my shoulder. You won't have to, Holden said. How can you say that? Because I'm not leaving till I'm sure you're safe. She stared at him like she didn't know how to hold those words. Then she whispered, I almost forgot what it felt like to be worth something. Holden walked to the steps and sat beside her. You didn't forget. You just stopped expecting it. Sadie turned toward him, her voice shook. And you? What did you stop expecting? Holden took a slow breath. Peace. They didn't talk after that. They sat shoulder to shoulder, quiet as the stars drifted across the sky. When she finally stood to go inside, she paused. "If I asked you to stay longer, would you?" "I already am," he said. Sadie nodded and stepped into the house. Holden slept on the porch that night. He didn't dream of danger or running. Just quiet. Just warmth. When daylight touched the hills, Sadie stepped out with a cup of coffee. She held it out to him without a word. He nodded. She nodded back. And that felt like something solid. Days turned into weeks. Sadie's steps grew sure on the ranch. She learned the names of every milk cow. She rose before dawn, rolled biscuits with cold hands, and scrubbed dishes until her fingers pinched from the soap. She no longer jumped when Tobias dropped a tool or when the wind slammed the barn door. Holden stayed in the bunkhouse, mending fences and helping Tobias train the young colts. He never said how long he meant to stay. Sadie never asked. But he lingered every evening, sometimes talking, sometimes not, just being there. One afternoon, a soft drizzle rolled over the pasture. Sadie sorted feed sacks in the barn when Holden stepped inside, shaking rain off his hat. "You ever been to the Tetons?" he asked. She glanced up. "No, just heard of them." "They're colder than you'd think, even in August." "I'd like to see them someday," she said. Holden leaned on the stall gate. "I went once when I was younger. Thought the mountains held something I lost." "Did they?" He shook his head. "Sometimes trying is worth more than finding." Sadie watched him, her eyes soft. "You don't speak like a man who spent his life on horseback." He shrugged. "Used to keep a book in my pack. Poems, mostly." "Poems?" she echoed. "Reckon I like the quiet in them. Can you remember one?" Holden looked up at the rafters and spoke steady. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep." Sadie whispered the last line with him. Their voices blended soft in the barn air. She took one slow breath. "My brother loved that one." "I thought he might have," Holden said. Later that evening, Sadie brought Holden a bowl of stew outside the bunkhouse. She sat beside him, close enough that their knees almost touched. The stars pushed through thin clouds. Tobias laughed faint in the distance. "When I was little," Sadie said, "I used to name the stars like neighbors." "You still name them, quote." She shook her head. "Not yet, but I might start again." Holden passed her the bowl. She took it, brushing his fingers, and neither of them pulled away. Late September came. The grass turned yellow. The air grew sharp with coming cold. One morning, Sadie found Holden checking the paddock gate. A new scrape marked his knuckle. "You were out late," she said. "Something spooked the cattle near the ridge. Might be a cougar." "You see tracks?" "No, just signs." She leaned on the fence. "You ever think about settling somewhere for good?" Holden didn't answer right away. "I used to," he said. "Before the war." "What changed?" He tested the hinge, then sighed. "Too many years on the move. Thought I wasn't made for staying." Sadie looked at him with steady eyes. "You're as steady as any man I've known." "That don't mean I don't doubt myself." She stepped closer. "I doubt myself every day, but I know what I want now." Holden met her eyes. "Tell me." "I want a place I don't have to leave, and someone who doesn't ask me to." Holden breathed slow. "I could be that man, if you'd let me." Sadie reached for his hand. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't mean it." 3 days later, Sadie came down from the loft with a bundle wrapped in a thin shawl. She found Holden in the lean-to sharpening his knife on a whetstone. His shoulders moved slow and steady, each motion the same as the one before. "I have something," she said. Holden stood and wiped his hands on his trousers. "What's that?" "Proof I'm more than a runaway with a knife." She opened the shawl. Inside was a small leather journal and a folded map with deep creases. Holden handled them with care. The cover of the journal was cracked. The pages looked worn from years of hands turning them. "My brother kept this," Sadie said. "He wrote about settling land near the Bighorns. He said the soil was rich. Said he'd take me there one day. After he died, I found it hidden under the floorboards. Roy never knew about it. Holden unfolded the map slowly. That land's still open, but it's wild. No guarantees. Sadie breathed in, steady. I don't want guarantees. I want a chance. Holden looked up at her. Would you want me there? I wouldn't ask otherwise. They spent the next 3 days gathering supplies. Mrs. Heartly gave them a canvas tent and a second mule. Tobias carved a small token from pine and tucked it into Sadie's satchel, thinking she wouldn't notice. She did. She hugged him anyway. On their last night at the ranch, Sadie stood in the bunkhouse doorway, her belongings tied neatly in a cloth. Holden looked up at her. You sure about this? He asked. She stepped closer. I was never sure of anything until I met you. Holden took her into his arms, not like he was claiming something. More like he was holding something he didn't know he needed until now. They left before dawn. The wagon creaked under the weight of tools, seed, and quiet hope. The sun rose behind them as they traveled west into land neither had seen, but both had pictured 100 times. For the first time since the night she ran, Sadie did not look behind her. They reached the basin 3 days before frost settled in the soil. The land stretched wide and untouched. No fences, no paths, just cottonwood trees near a creek and a rise of grass that waved like soft prayer in the wind. Sadie stepped down from the wagon and laid her hand on the earth. It felt cool and damp, full of promise. This is it, Holden said. Sadie nodded. Home. They set up the canvas tent beside a cluster of stones. That night, they ate cold beans by the fire. Sadie leaned against Holden's shoulder, and he rested his hand at her back. They did not talk much. They didn't need to. By the second week, they dug out a cellar and laid the base of their cabin. Sadie hauled stones from the creek. Holden split pine from the ridge. Their hands blistered, then hardened. Sadie rubbed tallow on Holden's shoulders at night. He kissed the top of her hair without asking. You ever think about children? She asked one evening while stitching muslin. Holden paused, setting down the draw knife. Sometimes. I used to think the world was too dangerous, too unsure. And now? Now I think I'd like to raise someone who doesn't know what fear feels like. Sadie touched her belly. Then we'll make a place safe enough for that. The cabin went up slow but sure. Sadie laid the hearthstones one by one. Holden carved the door latch from a twisted branch. When the roof finally rose, they stood side by side and watched their first smoke curl into the sky. Sadie placed her hand on the lintel and whispered something too soft for Holden to hear. But he saw the weight lift from her shoulders. Winter came early, but they stayed warm. Sadie baked bread from the last of the flour. Holden patched his coat with buckskin. Some nights they talked until the fire dimmed. Other nights they lay close, her breath warm against his neck. By spring the snow melted and the ground softened. Sadie planted beans, corn, and squash in neat rows. Holden built a smokehouse and fenced the pasture. They worked until the sky turned gold, then sat by the creek with their feet in the cold water. Late one May afternoon, Holden stepped out of the shed with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He walked to Sadie and brushed a curl from her cheek. I've made something. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a ring shaped like a sage leaf. Simple, hand-cast, brass. You made this? She whispered. I didn't want to give you something bought. I wanted to give you something built. Like everything else. Sadie looked down at the ring, then into his eyes. Put it on me. He slid it onto her finger with hands that had held her through fear and storms and long nights. Sadie leaned into him. I choose you, she said. They married that summer beneath the cottonwoods. No preacher, no crowd. Just 2 promises spoken plain. Sadie wore a dress she sewed from flour sacks. Holden wore his father's vest. The creek ran soft behind them like a blessing. By early fall, the baby was coming. Sadie told Holden by guiding his hand to her belly. When he felt the small shift of life inside her, his breath caught, and he held her tight. Years passed. The cabin grew. A cradle stood by the hearth. Tobias visited each spring to help with planting. Mrs. Heartly came once. silver hair tied back, and held Sadie's daughter like she was her own. Sadie taught the child to sow and plant by the moon. Holden taught her to ride bareback and start a fire with a single match. They never spoke Roy's name again. He did not belong in the world they built. Some evenings when the work was done and the cattle settled, Holden and Sadie sat together on the porch and watched the sun dip behind the ridge, their fingers intertwined. Their breaths slow and sure. They didn't need words. They had peace. And they had each other.